So if language has such flexibility, we're able to see linguistic changes that mirror or map onto cultural changes. We're also able to see that cultural changes can drive those linguistic changes. Then why does language kind of at that personal level feel so stable? Language is constantly in flux. It's being renegotiated, but most people experience their own language as stable and unchanging. Societies that have been blended by colonialism have developed some really interesting dynamic new languages, such as creoles and pidgins. So, the creole that's spoken in the Louisiana Bayou, that is a pidgin language of English and French. In Papua New Guinea, there are pidgin languages of kind of Dutch and English from colonialism that map onto some of the native or indigenous languages. And Papua New Guinea is a hard one because just in the highlands alone, in the mountainous areas, there are hundreds of distinct indigenous populations. So, language is constantly changing. New words are being added, um, new metaphors are being created, etc. There are some countries that have national language policies. French is one of these, in the sense of there is a specific board, a specific committee that has to hear testimony on words before they're accepted into the official French language. Now, that's kind of similar. I mean, Webster's does has new words submitted and has a kind of review process, but the French process in some cases has taken as long as 35 years before a new word has been added to the dictionary. So oftentimes, particularly for slang or newly innovated words tied to newly innovated aspects of culture, you get a lag time, really. All right, so with respects to national language policies, twice during the 20th century, Dutch monarchs have altered the official spelling of words to match contemporary pronunciations. What this has done is formally recognized choices made by speakers of a language. So, this is like the distinctions between gray with an E and gray with an A, or color, COLOR versus COLOUR. In contrast, France has made efforts to preserve traditional French by outlawing increasingly borrowed English words. These laws have little effect on everyday use of English borrowed words by French speakers. And so there's this bigger growing kind of divide between official, like high French, right, proper French, and the French that people use in their everyday daily conversations. French Canadians in the province of Quebec have been more successful at preventing or preserving Quebecois, the local dialect of French, against Canadian Anglicization or the creeping influence of English. Government businesses in the province of Quebec are government businesses conducted in French, and public signs have to be written in French. So if you travel to Quebec versus Saskatchewan, Alberta, etc., things are gonna be different, right? You're gonna see signs in English in some places, in Quebec only in French. So there have been like formal governmental processes to either allow for linguistic change or to preserve the high or official form of the language, kind of at all costs, at least for business purposes. In the United States, we've had similar sort of debates. We actually do not have an official language. There is nothing on the record books of English being our official language. Um, so there's nothing in legal codification that says that business must be conducted in English. Official languages are generally left up to the states levels to decide, and some states are more accepting of multiple languages than others. So there have been debates and disagreement over like the past 10 years in places like the Midwest or, like Minnesota, right? Fact of the matter is, Minnesota is pretty white. That area of our country was settled by Scandinavian immigrants predominantly. And I mean, this is the Midwest is where a lot of the tall, like 6 foot blonde-haired volleyball players come from. I just think about club volleyball. The New Mexico teams were always definitely in a minority when we went to regional competitions outside of just the southwestern region because um, a lot of these Midwest teams, Nebraska, Kansas, Minnesota, etc., have like full teams of like 6 foot plus blonde girls. So anyway, there's been debate in that area over whether Spanish should be allowed a role in government business and government documentation. And so there have been active votes against allowing government documents to be translated into Spanish. Can you imagine something similar here in New Mexico? I mean, it's just laughable to us. But here you think about APS. If you've had communication with APS because you've had children through APS, or whatever the reason may be, um, for the official APS documents, you can get them in Spanish, French, German, English, obviously, Thai, Vietnamese, Korean, Mandarin, Japanese, etc. It's actually pretty great to see the degree to which APS is willing to have official documentation in multiple language platforms. So US doesn't have an official language. Some states do kind of weigh in on official languages. There are countries, though, that do. In Switzerland, there are 5 official languages. It's is it 5 or is it 4? I'm spacing. It's English and then German, French, and Italian. So I guess 4 official languages, depending on the canton that you're in. So English is the country as a whole. German is the German cantons, French the French cantons, and Italian the Italian cantons. So we can see differences worldwide as to official languages or not. And as colonial empires retreated post World War II, then we saw uh, kind of retention of some of these colonial languages. So when the British left America in 1776, right, we didn't stop speaking English. We didn't revert back to indigenous languages. When the French left kind of Central Africa, um, French stayed as an official language. When the Dutch left Southeast Asia, Dutch stayed as part of their kind of suite of official languages. In a modern context, we are very, very worried about language loss. Indigenous groups around the world are facing language death. We consider a language to be lost when it no longer has any native speakers. When the last native speaker dies, then a language is lost. It's possible that as many as half of the world's languages face extinction within the next century. Thousands of small indigenous languages are gradually being replaced by a few bigger ones. So think about Amazonia. Okay, we're talking about Brazil, Peru, etc. There are movements to kind of nationalize Portuguese in Brazil, and obviously Spanish in other South American countries, um, to an extent that they almost have like this role of what Indian schools have played in the U.S. in the past. When people are forced into reservations, either at the hands of religion or the hands of government, language is one of the first things that is forced to switch. And so throughout South America, indigenous languages are giving way to predominantly Spanish, though Portuguese in Brazil. Throughout Africa, indigenous languages have given way to French, to Swahili, even to German in some places. So we're seeing more people kind of be forced into adopting um, larger, well-known languages at the expense of their indigenous tongue. We've lost 500 languages in the past 200 years. Okay, so we've got another 500 that are have the potential to be lost. There have been some really interesting efforts done to preserve these languages, though. In light of linguistic relativity, language is the primary way that people experience the richness of their culture. So when languages die, cultures die. The Smithsonian has, over about the past 10 years, funded a program that kind of builds something akin to a language arc. What do we mean by that? Well, they're working with indigenous populations around the world to do both photo and audio recordings or video recordings with an audio track to preserve those cultures that are at risk, so that there are pictures taken of people in native dress, and there are recordings of native speech, so that if we have a case of a spoken only language dying out, we don't have written documents that preserve that language and preserve the pronunciation, we at least have something to go back to, right? We almost lost Navajo prior to World War II, and it's taken a conscious effort to build the population of Native Navajo speakers. Indian schools in the US were a travesty. I mean, it was ethnocide, deliberately destroying people's ethnic cultural heritages by forcing them to dress quote unquote Western, speak English and or Spanish, stop eating their native foods, cut their hair, etc. So to preserve culture, we need to preserve language. So what is it then about your own individual language that makes it so personal and so much part of you, right? Think about what it is. Is it the strength of communication? You would be able to communicate with people as strongly if you used a different language, right? There are no languages that are quote unquote better in terms of complexity. Is it the metaphors that are used? They mean something to you, right? And then imagine, how is it that our language changes so seamlessly as we hear and adopt new words and expressions, right? It takes no time at all. Now, that's not entirely accurate. I want you to think about how you use language. And, we've got people of different age groups in this class. So some of you are younger, some of you a little bit older. So let's think about the way that a stereotypical high school/college student speaks, and then think about the way that their grandparents or their great-grandparents speak, right? Obviously, there's a generational shift. People of your generation or of a college/high school kids generation and their grandparents or great-grandparents are going to utilize language differently. A lot of that is because we are incredibly willing to adapt new cultural features, including linguistic features, really up to about the age of 25 or 30. When we're young, when we're really young, when we're kids, right, we're laying down all the neural networks that govern language. When we're teenagers, we're insulating those networks. We're adding the myelin sheath to our neurons, which makes the transmission much more effective without as much being lost, as much of the input being lost. So our adaptability and the fact that we're changing so much really from birth to age 25 makes us readily willing to accept different cultural trends, including different linguistic trends. We lose that as we get older. Generally, people in power also are less willing to adapt to cultural shifts. Those who possess less power are more willing to adapt and adopt new ways of speaking, new ways of thinking. So part of that is a function of our development and kind of our what we call neuroplasticity, right? And so if you want to incite a big cultural shift, how do you do that? Let's say you want to start a language trend. I don't know, you're doing some kind of sociology experiment or something like that. Who do you target? Well, if you want to change things, you target the youth. You target those younger individuals who are more plastic in their expression. If you want to change cultural ideals, you also you target the young. Those are going to be the people who are going to adopt new practices, new behaviors, new ways of dressing, new ways of speaking, etc. So because we live in a very intergenerational kind of society, right? Even though different people may use slightly different expressions, slightly different linguistic features, kind of as a whole, they seem rather unified. All right. So, with respect to sociolinguistics, let's think for a moment of language as social capital. How does language relate to power and social inequality? Language ideology refers to the beliefs people have about the superiority of one language or dialect and the inferiority of others. So, have you seen in movies how people talk about the Queen's English, right? If we take the British Isles, there's definitely the mindset that the higher form, the educated form of English is much better than, let's say, any of the regional dialects, let's say Cockney or something like that, right? We ascribe social capital to the languages that we speak. We just arbitrarily make kind of judgment calls about the superiority of some languages over others. So, is there anything intrinsically superior about the quote unquote Queen's English? No, there isn't. Both are equally complex, both are equally valid as kind of methods of communication. But what we do is we link language with identity, morality, and aesthetics. So we shape our image of who we are as individuals and as members of social groups and institutions based on the language that we use. There is no correct way to speak any language. There is nothing that says the Queen's English is better than any dialect. Hochdeutsch is not better than any regional dialect. From an anthropological perspective, there are only people who are more and less privileged and use more or less privileged versions of language. So nothing inherent in the US about Black English vernacular, African American English vernacular versus standard American English. However, because we as a country have systematically oppressed people of color, as a country, we ascribe less social capital to the typical way that people of color speak when they're communicating with other people of color, right? We are ascribing value to a language simply based on how the institutions in our culture value people who use that language. This is certainly prevalent across races. Of course, races are a social construct. There's not a biological basis for race. From a biological standpoint, we are one race, and that is the human race. But we recognize racial shifts in language. There can be other ethnic shifts that aren't racial in terms of language, and we see gender contrast as well. So Lakoff researched female versus male speech patterns, and we've already talked about this a little bit. That female speech patterns were expected to express hesitation, repetition, and uncertainty more than male speech patterns. This represents females' lower place in society. I mean, we still don't have equal footing in society. For example, the Equal Rights Amendment that we've been trying to get through Congress for decades still has yet to pass. So women are not guaranteed rights of autonomy over their own bodies, their own decisions, etc. Unfortunately, in a professional setting, the appearance of uncertainty can be detrimental to your status. So women's speech in a professional setting, if they're utilizing gender-specific speech patterns, they're seen as less willing to make hard decisions. They're seen as more conciliatory, friendlier, but friendly isn't always beneficial when we're talking about these professional settings. Language is also associated with other social status, with the creation and maintenance of social status. So, if we look at the Indonesian island of Java, individuals are conscious of their status, and we see politeness and position within the social hierarchy expressed in nearly every sentence. So those who are at a lower social strata will speak with deference, always acknowledging the higher social status of the people with whom they're speaking. So we've got distinct styles of speech that reinforce the social stratification. Words are spoken in 3 different registers on the island of Java. There's informal speech, which is kind of your casual speech with your peers. There's intermediary register, and then there's polite speech. And polite speech is what you would engage in business communications, in educational settings, in government situations, etc. Javanese words that are used by each speaker and listener will be different and mark their relative social positions in society. The same can be said of caste differences in India. So, in many cultures, those kind of those addresses of people, the kind of labels that you put on people, are reinforced through qualifiers in the language that reflect relative social status. We also saw um, ascribed social status or social capital given to languages in light of colonialism. 19th century European colonial powers introduced their languages as quote unquote official languages. They sought to replace indigenous languages with European ones and thus ascribed knowledge of those European dominant languages with higher social status. In many of those colonies, these languages persist even decades after their independence. And in many of those contexts, indigenous languages were lost forcibly in some cases, and um, uh, just kind of assimilation in other cases. So, what does all this mean for today? Well, we are living in uncharted territory. We are increasingly using technology and using new technologies to communicate. So, we've seen a huge shift and a very abrupt shift in the role that texting plays. I personally prefer to text than to talk on the phone. Sometimes I feel like I've lost some of my social skills because it's just so much easier to text than it is to call people. Social media sites and those venues of communication. These have all opened up new ways to communicate. They've included simplified spellings, they've included abbreviations, IDK for I don't know, BRB for be right back, SMH, shaking my head, right? All of these LOL, all of these text speak kinds of expressions. And then iconic emojis. One of the dangers of using virtual means of communication, specifically when it's written only, is that you miss out on some of the nuances. My preferred method of humor is sarcasm. Sarcasm doesn't convey well in text or email. So we've tried to innovate new ways to express that through like a winky face emoticon or emoji, or parentheses J/K for just kidding, etc. We've come up with ways to try to convey what we mean with what we're saying, right? In ways where pitch, stance, eye contact, other kinds of facial expressions, etc., would communicate that in a different context if we were in a face-to-face context. Technology has always influenced linguistic changes. We expect that because language is dynamic, um, always adjusting to these new conditions that people encounter. So we shouldn't be surprised that we've come up with ways like emojis uh, to sorry, to convey meaning in these new forms of communication. But we have to also recognize that there are aspects of our communication that are changing. Okay, I want you all to think for a moment about miscommunication in a virtual context. Have any of you ever had a falling out with your friends, or gotten in trouble at work, or somehow or other created a big misunderstanding because of the way that you communicated something in a written context, in a text or in an email? Right? Almost all of us have. I'd be surprised if any of you said no, that you haven't ever had one of these miscommunications. I inadvertently offend people all the time. I'm aware of that. I try to kind of preface I don't know, preface each class with, okay, so sometimes my emails can be a little blunt. I've also tried to get better at that to convey politeness when I'm emailing or texting, but it depends kind of on what I'm doing at the time that I send that reply. Sometimes it still comes across as rather blunt without me implying or intending offense. Um, but public discourse is changing. Think about reading comments on social media, right? Should you read the comments to articles? Should you read the comments to arguments on social media? Only if you are utilizing that Michael Jackson meme where he's sitting in the movie theater with his popcorn, right? Um, Comment threads are real rabbit holes. That's a metaphorical use of Alice in Wonderland, in case you don't know that one. But we fall down the rabbit hole when we start reading the comment threads. People are awful to each other in this near anonymous context of social media. Think about bullying. Okay. I spent middle school bullied nonstop, spent high school bullied nonstop. But people could only do it to my face or through notes that they wrote. Or, I mean, they could try to call, but generally my brother would answer the phone, so they never got very far that way. I don't know that I would have survived my young teen years if I were growing up now, if we had this context of social or cyber bullying, because people say things online that they would never dare to say face to face. Death threats, threats against the families of people. Think about Gamergate, the death threats that women who've been writing in gaming technology have experienced. Um, the fact that people regularly dox people who say things that they disagree with, and then post things like their full name, their address, their phone number, their email, sometimes even their bank account information, etc., as a way to invite anyone who also disagrees with them to retaliate against them. I mean, we are crossing some major boundaries, and we've got to be careful with that, right? How do we relate this to the fact that about half of you are going into an educational setting? Well, cyberbullying is real, right? We lost a lot of high school students this year, and it's something that people haven't really acknowledged or talked about. But we had a lot of seniors this school year who committed suicide, right? There were suicide pacts, but a lot of this comes from cyberbullying, and the fact that in this online context, people can be downright horrible to one another. My own family's experienced it. So be careful what you say, be careful how you use language. Talk to your students, talk to the kids you come in contact with um, about good media literacy and etiquette, right? We have to be one of the humanities teachers at the high school that I work at really hits home with her students about not just being a bystander, but being what is called an upstander, where we speak out when we see people being mistreated. We speak out in support of people, not by making threats, but um, by alerting people that that kind of behavior or language isn't going to be tolerated. Um, think about that context in terms of race relations right now, right? We're having protests and demonstrations because of yet another white police officer killing a man for being black, um, unprovoked, really, stepping over the line, police brutality. So think about how white people can be allies to blacks, to Native Americans, to anybody of minority status, right? How do we use our privilege to be an ally and support people to the point that we really can experience equality? As we become increasingly globalized, this is going to matter more and more, right? Not only do we need to speak out in our community in support of people that we see being oppressed, but we need to speak out in the world of business. We need to make smart purchasing decisions to support fair working conditions, both in terms of the treatment of people, but also the treatment of climate, right? You shouldn't buy your shirts from Walmart unless you really want to support sweatshops in places like Vietnam and Bangladesh. as we become increasingly globalized, we become more aware of inequality around the world and how particularly corporations foster that. And we all need to try our darndest to be upstanders. I mean, in the capacity that we're able to fill. So, um, as we see more and more hate speech, more and more actions that capitalize upon um, ethnocentric based kind of discrimination and prejudice, we, particularly if you are in a position of privilege, we need to speak up. We need to be these upstanders. All right, so do these innovations like texting actually affect the way that people speak? Do they degrade our language? Well, degrade is a loaded term, right? Do they change our language? Yes, absolutely. Does that make our language less sophisticated, less effective as a communication method? No, not at all, right? There's no better or worse language. Now, I will say when you turn in typed work, please don't use text speak. I don't want you to write, Dr. Mueller said blank, 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 LOL. Use formal, actual written English, capitalize, use punctuation, etc. But am I guilty of sometimes like texting LOL to somebody or sometimes even saying LOL? Yeah, of course. We find these things creeping into our spoken language. And there's not necessarily something inherently wrong with that. Okay, one other little soapbox thing. Um, our teenagers are missing out on face-to-face communication opportunities. Okay, we just have to be aware of that. So if you're going into education, you plan on having kids, you have kids already, your kids are grown and you're a grandparent, whatever, recognize that always having your face in your phone and always communicating through things like text or instant messenger or whatever, you run the risk of losing those skills. Specifically, you run the risk of reinforcing the neural connections that favor text speak and not reinforcing those neural connections that teach you how to communicate face to face. So make your kids answer the phone, talk about phone etiquette. It, at least make them be off their phone during dinner so you can sit and have conversations, right? One great thing that you can do with peers is if you go out, if we're ever allowed to go out again, right? As soon as you get somewhere, everybody put their phone face down in a pile in the middle of the table. First person to touch it has to cover the bill for everybody, right? There are ways that we can be creative in fostering and requiring people to have face-to-face conversations. It matters because those teenagers are going to someday need to probably be able to interview for a job. And if you can't communicate in a face to face basis, not going to be very successful at interviewing for a job. And particularly as schools have been closed and more virtual distance learning, we're missing out on even those face to face conversations in the classroom. So we got to have a way to practice, make a conscious decision to have a way to practice FaceTime people, Zoom people, or whatever. But just be aware of it, that particularly for kids between about the ages of 12 and 25. You've got to reinforce methods of communication that you want them to be able to use as adults. So you've got to foster opportunities to practice so that they're learning those skills and so that they're reinforcing those neural networks. All right, so students often feel they will never be able to participate in the professional lives of their advisors because advisors and professors speak a language that many students don't understand. Of course, they're speaking English, but they use complex words that students know. So how does language in this situation become a tool of control or power over students? If we as instructors, we as teachers, we as educators use language that is inaccessible to our students, we reinforce a distinct power dynamic where we are dominant and they are subordinate. So, think about this, reflect on this. I know I use big words. My tactic is to always provide definitions of those big words. And I do it even more with my high schoolers than I do it in this context of, college education. But I still do it even with C&M classes. If I use a phrase, a word that I don't know that you'll understand, I try to give an explanation of it. So just even the way that people address you reinforces that power dynamic. In early childhood ed, it always seems that it's I would be Miss Tanya, right? For some reason, Students in New Mexico have a tendency to just call their teachers Miss. I hate that. I absolutely hate it. And I bring it up and I reinforce not using that as a method of addressing your teacher with my students. Let's stop calling people Miss. Let's use their name. That's a sign of respect, right? But do you require it to be Mrs. Mueller for me or Dr. Mueller for me? And I always tell people that kind of depends on the context that we're in. In this context of us being closer to one another in age, I don't mind you guys calling me Tanya. That doesn't bother me. Um, in a context of an age differential, right? Like my students tend to call me either Ms. Mueller or Dr. Mueller. And that relates to this tendency that we don't really want or expect youth to refer to adults by their first name. That's at least the world I grew up in. But it's like, do we want to hold that kind of power over our students? Do we want there to be a distinct power struggle, or can we adjust maybe not what they refer to us as, maybe not um, those terms of address, but at least in the language that we use to teach? Do we want to maintain a power differential, or do we want to make our language more accessible to students?